Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Policy, talking about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, finally, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, called Skeleton Tree. I know the easiest way to start this review. It's also the way I don't want to start this review. It feels cheap and exploitative to acknowledge it, especially given how so many music websites have covered this story. I can't imagine how much it stings every time he might see a review, and the first thing that's mentioned is, well, goddammit, this is hard. Harder than for most artists, mostly because of acts that have defined my evolution as a music critic over the past few years. Nick Cave looms as one of the biggest. His album, The Good Son from 1990, I would call a classic 10 out of 10 album, and that's not even counting Henry's Dream, Murder Ballads, The Boatman's Call, Tender Prey, and Push the Sky Away, the last of which, if you don't remember, was my best album of 2013. Spoilers, going back to that album, I stand by that pick too. Some might consider it too slow and muted and impenetrable, but there's a genuine unsettling power in the cryptic writing once you decode it. One of the few albums that when Nick Cave is called an apocalypse prophet by some of his cult, he kind of earns that title. So of course, when I heard he was working on a new project in 2014, I was thrilled, but then came the news that his 15-year-old son Arthur had died in a tragic accident on the cliffs outside of Brighton, and there's no way around the fact that it would color this album, especially when Nick Cave had gone back into the studio to finish the recording. This happened midway through. Most of the songs have been written, but latter takes have been semi-improvised, as Nick Cave noted that he had lost his faith in narrative-based songs. The sort of statement that can ring is kind of frightening, coming from the man that wrote Murder Ballads. For such a storyteller to lose his faith in that form, it's understandable, but genuinely chilling as a fan and reflective of the deep, unyielding pain that he had to be experiencing. As such, there was a part of me that didn't even want to listen to the album. It felt too personal, too real, almost reminiscent of Black Star, the last album that David Bowie wrote before he died. And as you can all likely tell by this point, I was almost certain that this album would get to me just about as deeply, if not more so. But you know what, by this point, with so many critics hailing Skeleton Tree as one of the best albums of this year, it's currently the highest rated record on Metacritic, if you put stock in such things, even though I don't. But I had to hear this. What'd I hear? Well, you know, it's easier to talk around this album than talk about the album itself. I can rattle off a bunch of facts about it, how it's the shortest record in Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds' entire discography, how it follows some of the sound of Push the Sky Away, but also takes steps towards electronic grooves and synths and avant-garde spoken word, territory where Nick Cave has never gone before, how the record was mostly written and recorded before that trauma and left more raw and imperfect in its finished state on Nick Cave's request, which I should hope is enough to silence the cynics and callow cretins who think that he's some sort of grief profiteer, especially as so many words rang as eerily prophetic as David Bowie's Black Star did. Death does weigh on this album, but it's an omnipresence rather than the main subject. Removed from that context, this album would still be a harrowing, heartbreaking listen from an artist at the depths of pain that's impossible to fake. But when you add context, well, it just means I can't listen to it in public. It got to me that much. But it's more than just that context, but it's Nick Cave's delivery, his performance, himself. Throughout the decades in the industry, his voice has spanned post-punk shrieks and cackles, the smooth baritone of singer-songwriters like Leonard Cohen, the roars of hard rock, and the whispers of a man who has seen humanity at its best and worst and accepted all of it. But always through these songs, Nick Cave has had a larger-than-life presence, a figure whose charisma and command of his atmosphere has demanded attention beyond just his themes and indulgences. And yet, Skeleton Tree shows that there are weights that can bring low even figures such as he. His voice is the thinnest and most frail that it's ever been on this album, holding just enough depth and power to draw on the ear, but also display that the power is cracked. His cadence is restless and aimless, often slipping off the measure in the beat and cracking at the edges. But it's that imperfection that reflects a raw pain and humanity that's always saved Nick Cave in my eyes from becoming a caricature, but now is plainly seen for everyone. It recalls the sort of emotion you get watching figures of the impossible strength buckle, or show the human emotion you never allowed yourself to believe that these people had. I would call it a tour de force performance, if I remotely believe that there is anything being performed on this album rather than just spoken. And as such, the orchestration is rather minimal and easily the most brittle of any Bad Seeds release. The richer atmospheric soundscapes that push the sky away are clawed back to smaller spaces that still evoke enough negative space to intensify that isolation. But take the opening song, the buzzing, seething grind of the guitar, touched by swells of strings as a single, clear, broken minor chord keens over the waste against the barest of drums and piano. And yet, as Nick Cave speaks, even before the fractured multi-tracking comes through, it's a call across that warping emptiness that binds you to answer. The next song, Rings of Saturn, breaks into glossy fragments of chilly synths that he's never used, that ebb off a cracking lo-fi drum machine as the thin backing vocals croon around him, openly flawed against the waves of melody and foundation of piano, but ethereal and haunting in a way that lets the melody coax out all the words. And yet Girl in Amber takes that glitter and calcifies it, ossifies it, only letting it twinkle through faded synths and a piano fragment, a backing vocals a foggy echo before the somber strings and hints of noise allows Nick Cave an escape back into the dust and darkness. And it gets even darker from there. Magneto's all sparse, textured guitar pops and strums, melancholic pianos, and a mix where the sound waves themselves seems to materialize into fragments of half-heard noise and feedback that still manages to bring together a real melody. One of the wonders of this album, for as much as it quivers and breaks the fragments, there is always the foundations of composition beneath it, proof of a master. And of course, where that's most tested is the next track, Anthrocene, where the tones keen over the piano foundation as the most spastic and unstable drum line roils over the bass of the track against the tide of popping fuzz. It almost kind of reminds me of Radiohead's The King of Limbs, except given an alien gravitas that album never dared to touch. And yet, the tension driven by that song translates into something more aching on I Need You, as the sparse tapping kick drum and cymbals swell into a harsher synth as the backing vocals add just enough swell to match the accent of gentle acoustic touches as Nick Cave chokes back his own tears. And yet the tone of the grief seems to kind of shift against the gentle touches of bell and organ on Distant Sky. The pain is still very much there as the faded drum fills cascade out of the darkness, but with the lilting Gex vocals of Elsie Torp, you get the hint that a twinkle is starting to re-emerge. But then Warren Ellis' strings start coming through and yeah, I can't even describe it. Now, before I get to the title track and the last song on this album, we need to talk about lyrics and themes. Be on the obvious, of course. But that's part of the unearthly mood about this album. Nick Cave has always written about death and loss and confronting the unknowable, with the framing to speak to everyone beyond just his cult following. And from the first song, Jesus Alone, Nick Cave embodies that prophet who will speak to all, both the pure and the damned, knowing that judgment is coming, although it's left ambiguous what that judgment might be. And yet, the next song, Rings of Saturn, has him trapped and paralyzed, at the mercy of a venomous spider-like creature, the sort of unexplained presence to which he cannot blame, yet seems aware that something has gone deeply, deeply wrong. And only then you realize that the astronomical symbol of the pagan god of agriculture, Saturn, it was a sickle, a symbol that Christian religions would later reinterpret to indicate a sign of death. All the more fitting from a creature weaving a web on rings that might appear gorgeous from a distance, but in reality are frozen and desolate. And that web grows all the thicker on Girl in Amber, filled with references to the song that the Bad Seeds have spun since 1984, and yet that sound has stopped the way it was. The words are desolate as hopes of ghosts truly linger have been dashed, and he, and likely his wife along with him, implied to be that woman in amber, are left alone in the emptiness to twist in the non-existent wind, retreating inwards to seek either pain or escape, avoiding any touch that might further break him. And Magneto gets all the darker, the opening implying the gory torture that he worked in his music, the graphic passions that he worked himself through, and now to see himself as a lesser man like everyone else, to be pitied, raises both a rage and yet a hidden desire to be just like them. He sees his frailties all the more sharply, and those who would rend him asunder, the worlds that he built so many illusions and dreams, and now touching them feels like just going through the motions. He needs that one more time with feeling. Anthrocene gets even more clinical with it, as he sees himself in the wider world, as he sees humanity continuing to stumble in their search for love, and yet have the power to shape the world around them unlike any other time before. Not that far. as he is all the more acutely aware. But now amidst the rest of the world, he can't avoid that pain much longer, and cast against mundane supermarkets and his home, he sees a figure that might have come before but now is draped in red. And it's very clear from Nick Cave's delivery that this is the closest he's come thus far to dealing with that truth. How no matter how hard he tries to stand firm or predict the future on his palm, he cannot defeat death. And while his son has passed and will always be in his heart, he's not living there, he's not alive, and he's not coming back. But then this album did something I did not expect. I should have expected it. Push the Sky Away did something very similar in its reserved, distant sort of way, especially at the ending. But through all the bittersweet grief and anger and desolate loneliness comes Distant Sky, where he cuts the lamps and looks skyward as he admits that gods and dreams do not outlive us, represented by the many lights filling up the sky. And yet, he's tugged away in the final verse. It's not for him to stare up into the heavens where his son has moved on, his soul rising with the stars, at peace. The sun rose, sun set, but the stars linger. And then we get the title track, and it's gentle. Piano, a cushion of organ, strums of acoustic guitar, and sparse drums as he stands alone on a Sunday morning, staring at a TV without the signal that could go beyond, a call sent out over the endless sea with only the echo that's answered. All the more of a sign that the pain, it's not going away, it's always going to be there, it will always resonate in his mind. But as he sings in the final coda, it's all right now. The illusions are shattered and broken, the trauma remains open, nothing's for free after all, and he paid that cost, but he'll live. It's a moment of bittersweet hope that doesn't render this record impossible to revisit in the same way that Sufjan Stevens' Carrie and Lowell was. That didn't have that closed ending. But while I thank Cave for giving us that sort of respite, I think he needed it a lot more than I did. You know, I've gotten comments on videos saying, how dare I assign a rating or criticize art when I can't possibly know the struggle of its creation and message. It wasn't until I covered this album that those comments took a lot of weight for me. Because on some level, this is the sort of art that feels almost too intimate and painful to ever be released and shared. The sort of shattering of oneself that I pray that I'll never have to face. And yet, for as lonely as this record can feel, it also shows the breaking of hubris. No longer the god with the red right hand, but the man who shared the trauma so that we, like him, can find closure in the face of that one great certainty. It's raw, it's misshapen, it's imperfect, by far not an easy listen. And yet, I can't imagine a piece that fulfills its mission quite like this. In other words, it's a 10. That's 2 10s this year, next to Dave Cobb's compilation masterpiece Southern Family. Both deal with family and death, and yet both end with the simplest of statements, touched by gospel. It's all right.